Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into the problem with science in the media.
Yeah, we really are. And it's a huge problem.
It is wild because, up to like 75% of the groundbreaking science news you're reading right now, like on your phone today, wasn't even written by a journalist.
Right. It's just copy pasted.
Exactly. Copy-pasted straight from a university's advertising department. So we're tracing that broken pipeline today to see, exactly how scientific discoveries make that whole journey.
From like a quiet laboratory all the way to those flashy articles you just scroll past on your feed.
Yeah, we're going to look at why that journey is completely broken right now, and probably most importantly, how you can spot the traps that are just waiting for you in your daily news feed.
Definitely. And to do this, we're pulling from a really diverse stack of information. We've got university studies, research from the field of journalism, and these massive media consumption surveys.
A lot of data to unpack.
Tons of data. But the goal is to connect all these dots so you can understand why the news sometimes makes science seem, I don't know, incredibly confusing or constantly changing.
Or unnecessarily scary. That happens a lot.
Oh, all the time. We're looking at why the actual truth gets completely lost in what is essentially a giant global game of telephone.
A giant game of telephone is like such a great way to picture it. But I want to give you an even more specific image for this deep dive. I want you to imagine a giant, incredibly chaotic food factory.
Okay, I like this. A food factory.
Yeah, so at one far end of this factory, you have the scientists.
Yeah.
And they are like the bakers. They're carefully trying to bake this very specific, complex cake. That cake is their research.
Yeah.
And in the middle of the factory, you have the delivery drivers. Those are the journalists. And they are just like rushing around frantically trying to get that cake to the store display window.
Probably hitting a few speed bumps along the way.
Exactly. And at the exact opposite end, there's you. You are just trying to buy a quick slice of dessert while you're scrolling on your phone.
Makes sense.
But because of everything that happens inside that chaotic factory, the rushing and the dropping, by the time that cake reaches you, it might look and taste like a totally different dessert.
That is a perfect analogy because, the instinct is usually just to blame the delivery drivers.
We always blame the reporters.
Always.
Yeah.
Whenever an article gets the facts wrong or causes a total panic, the public just points fingers at the news. But to understand where the system actually breaks down, we really have to start at the very beginning of the assembly line.
We have to look at the bakers.
Exactly. The science starts with the scientists themselves. And honestly, the environment they work in is fundamentally different than what most people realize.
I mean, I think most of us, myself included, we usually picture scientists as these very calm, quiet people in white coats, right? Just patiently looking through microscopes.
Searching for the noble truth.
Yeah, without a care in the world, just doing science. But the sources we're looking at today, they paint a picture of an environment that is incredibly cutthroat.
It really is. The reality of modern science is it's an intense pressure cooker. The sources actually call this a publish or perish culture.
Publish or perish. That sounds intense.
It's exactly what it sounds like. If you're a scientist at a university or a research institute, your entire career, like keeping your job, getting promoted, and getting the massive amounts of money you need to run your lab, all of it depends on you constantly publishing new research in prominent journals.
So you can't just coast.
No, you have to constantly produce. And it can't just be any research either. There's this massive structural demand for exciting, surprising, groundbreaking results.
Okay, let's pull on that thread for a second about how the money actually works. Because, if a scientist spends 3 years testing a new medicine and finds out it does absolutely nothing.
Which happens a lot.
Right, but that feels like really important information for other doctors to have. Like, you want to know what doesn't work so you don't waste time on it.
Exactly. A null result. Finding out a chemical doesn't cure a disease, or some new battery material doesn't actually hold a charge. That is vital data.
It stops other labs from wasting time.
It saves millions of dollars. But prestigious science magazines, they don't want to publish a paper that just says, hey, we tested a thing and absolutely nothing happened.
That's a boring magazine.
Right. They want fireworks. They want to announce the next big revolution. So when scientists realize that boring results won't get them published, and not getting published means their lab literally loses its funding and people lose their jobs.
A shift happens.
A very dangerous shift. They start to engage in what the sources call hyping their work.
Okay, so they start overpromising.
Basically, yeah, they take a tiny discovery, maybe something that only worked on a single cell in a plastic dish.
And they pitch it as the cure for a major disease.
Exactly. Or they tweak a tiny wire in a lab and promise, oh, this is going to lead to a world-changing new phone battery by next year.
And they do this just to get the money.
Yeah, because excitement attracts grant money. The more revolutionary the claim, the more likely it is to catch the eye of the people handing out the checks.
But the reality is, those cures or technologies might be decades away.
If they're even possible at all. So this sets a trap at the very beginning of the pipeline. It creates this false hope for regular people who eventually read about it. And honestly, the desperation to produce these hyped-up papers has reached such a fever pitch that scientists are doing some wild things.
Oh, you're talking about the AI thing?
Yes, they are turning to computer programs to churn out the work for them.
Okay, the section in the research about artificial intelligence completely threw me. We're talking about text-generating AI programs being used by actual scientists to write up their incredibly complex research.
It's happening constantly.
The sources highlight this one professor from a super prestigious business school, the Wharton School, who literally admitted she uses artificial intelligence for every aspect of her research.
And the researchers in that study, they didn't just rely on one person's admission. They used these specialized detection tools to scan thousands of submitted science papers and even the peer reviews written about them.
Wait, they were scanning the reviews too?
Yeah, they were looking for the specific mathematical signatures of machine-generated text, things like highly predictable word choices and just a lack of natural human variation.
And what did they find?
They found that the use of these artificial intelligence writing programs is just flooding the entire scientific ecosystem.
Wow. So if the machines are writing the papers, and other machines are probably being used to review the papers, the volume of research must just be going through the roof.
It's skyrocketing.
It's like an email inbox getting completely overrun with automated spam.
That's a great way to put it. The sheer volume of research being submitted has shot up because the barrier to producing text has dropped to essentially zero, but the quality has plummeted.
Because it's a machine just guessing what sounds right.
Right. The sources note that this flood of machine-written text is often poorly constructed, it lacks any deep critical thought, and it makes the actual science much harder to evaluate. The whole system of peer review is getting clogged with lower quality work.
All pushed out just to meet that relentless demand to publish or perish.
Exactly.
So going back to our factory analogy, this totally changes how I view the scientists. They aren't just calmly baking a cake. It's more like a cutthroat culinary competition show where presenting a normal, nutritious muffin gets you eliminated on the spot.
You're out of the kitchen.
Right. So the bakers are engineering these structurally unstable, towering sugar sculptures covered in bright sprinkles, literally just to survive the round. And now they have machines just pumping out these crazy cupcakes nonstop.
They are over-decorating the product to survive the environment, and when that cupcake is absolutely covered in the sweet sugar of hype, it looks irresistible to the next person in line.
The media.
The media. They're walking by the window display, they take the bait, and they grab that overly decorated, flashy dessert. And the actual healthy ingredients, the nuanced facts of the research, they just get buried under a giant pile of sugar.
Which brings us to the middle of our factory. The delivery drivers.
Yeah.
The messengers, the reporters. Because the scientists have baked this overly frosted cake. But how does it actually get from that high-pressure laboratory into your daily news feed?
Well, it happens through the newsrooms, but we have to recognize that the news industry is facing a pressure cooker that is just as intense, if not worse, than the academic world.
Really? Worse than the scientists?
Yeah, because news companies today are operating on incredibly thin margins. A lot of their traditional ways of making money, like selling local advertisements in printed papers.
Oh, right. Nobody buys the print paper anymore.
Exactly. That model has completely collapsed. So to survive financially, they have had to gut their staff, and the first people cut from the budget are almost always the specialists.
You mean the dedicated science reporters, like the people who actually understand the jargon.
Right. It used to be totally standard for a major newspaper to have a dedicated science desk. They'd employ someone who had studied biology or physics, someone who actually knew how to read a complex methodology section.
And someone who had the time to do it.
Yes. The luxury of time to call 3 independent experts to verify a new claim. Today, those specialized jobs are largely extinct.
So who is writing the science news?
A general assignment reporter. So one day they're covering a local city council dispute, the next day they're covering a high school football game, and the day after that, they are suddenly handed a dense paper on quantum physics.
Oh, man.
Or like a new pharmaceutical trial, and their boss tells them to have an article ready by lunch.
Okay, if I am that rushed reporter and my boss says I need 1,000 words on quantum physics in 2 hours, I am going to be desperate for a shortcut. I literally wouldn't even know where to begin reading the study.
And that desperation is exactly where the system breaks down. Rushed reporters rely on something the journalism sources call information subsidies.
Information subsidies. That sounds very academic.
It does, but it simply means a pre-written summary. So when a university wants to show off that heavily frosted cupcake we talked about, their public relations team,
Which is essentially their advertising department.
right, their PR team writes up a highly polished, super exciting summary of the research, and they hand this summary directly to the journalists.
It's a free cheat sheet.
A completely prepackaged news story, complete with catchy quotes and simplified bullet points. Because the reporters have absolutely no time to act as real investigators,
Right.
they often just copy and paste these summaries.
Literally just copy and paste.
Yeah, maybe they change a few adjectives and then they publish them directly under their own names as news.
The numbers on this are staggering. Looking at the research, it shows that between 42% and 75% of science stories in the news are just copy-pasted press releases.
It's massive.
And this isn't just happening on like obscure low-budget blogs.
No.
The sources point out this is happening at massive, highly respected organizations like the major national news stations in Britain. Up to 75% of the time, you are reading an advertisement disguised as a news article.
It's a huge problem. And to fully grasp why this is dangerous, we have to look at what those public relations summaries intentionally leave out.
Okay, what are they hiding?
There was a really interesting study done by a university in the Netherlands. They tracked exactly how research about ocean plastic was reported.
Ocean plastic, okay.
They looked at the original scientific data, then the PR summary, and finally the resulting news articles. When the university advertising team sent out their summaries, they highlighted all the dramatic, exciting details about ocean plastic pollution,
Naturally.
but they systematically scrubbed two crucial pieces of context.
The funding and the flaws.
Yes. First, they left out who paid for the study. And funding is a massive variable in science.
Right, because if a consortium of plastic manufacturing companies funds a study on ocean plastic,
The reader absolutely deserves to know that.
yeah, that feels like a pretty huge conflict of interest.
Exactly. And second, they scrubbed the limitations of the study. Every single scientific endeavor has limitations. Maybe their sampling equipment wasn't sensitive enough, or they only tested one tiny square mile of a massive ocean.
You can't test everything.
Right. And the original scientists almost always list these flaws in their paper, but the advertising summary just deletes them so the research sounds absolutely flawless and definitive.
And because the journalist is just copying and pasting the summary, those missing pieces never make it into the final news article.
Never.
Okay, this is literally like a high school student copying a friend's chemistry lab report, but intentionally leaving out the note at the top that says, by the way, half the equipment was broken and I guessed on the final equation.
That's exactly what it is.
You're passing off a highly conditional guess as a hard, proven fact. And the teacher, which in this case is you, the reader, has absolutely no clue.
The journalist's fundamental role in society is to act as a watchdog, you know? They are supposed to protect the public by questioning authority, finding the hidden motives, and demanding the full context.
But when they just copy the cheat sheet,
When they rely entirely on those information subsidies, they abandon that role. They transform into a megaphone for the university's PR team, just amplifying the hype without applying any critical filter.
okay, but let's imagine a scenario where we actually have a reporter who tries to do their job properly. Like they don't copy and paste. They sit down, they look at the actual science, and they try to translate the math and the discoveries themselves.
A noble effort.
Right. What happens when a general reporter tries to interpret complex data on a super tight deadline?
Unfortunately, even well-meaning reporters often fall into severe logical traps. And this is the third part of our factory breakdown, the translation phase.
Okay.
Because science and the news operate on two fundamentally opposed wavelengths. Science speaks the language of probability.
Right. Chances and likelihoods.
Exactly. Margins of error, tiny incremental shifts in data over years. The news industry, on the other hand, hates probability. The news demands certainty.
They want a catchy, simple headline that fits on a phone screen.
Exactly. They want a clear villain and a clear hero. They want direct cause and effect. And this mismatch between careful, slow math and the demand for snappy, urgent headline generates massive errors.
And the sources outline a few specific traps that reporters fall into when trying to force that science into a headline. The first major one is the before and after trap.
Yeah. In classical logic, this is a very well-known fallacy. It's the assumption that just because event B happens sequentially after event A must have caused event B.
But humans are pattern-seeking creatures, so our brains naturally want to connect two sequential dots, even if there is no actual string between them.
Exactly.
Let's put that into a real-world scenario. Let's say I have a huge math test coming up. The night before, I study for 5 solid hours. Right. Then the next morning, I put on a pair of bright red Lucky socks. I take the test and I get an A. The before and after trap would be the news writing a headline that says, "Red Sox cure bad grades."
Spot on. They completely ignore the massive, invisible effort of studying because the socks were the most visible thing that happened right before the test.
That makes total sense.
You see this constantly in health and wellness reporting. Someone adopts a bizarre new diet trend, they happen to feel a burst of energy a week later, and suddenly there is a viral article declaring this obscure root vegetable is a miracle cure for fatigue.
While ignoring everything else they did.
Exactly. The article ignores the fact that the person also started sleeping 8 hours a night and drinking way more water.
The next trap mentioned in the sources feels even more common, to be honest. The two things at once trap.
Yeah, this is the confusion between correlation and causation. It happens when two things occur at the exact same time and the observer assumes one is directly triggering the other.
Give me an example of this one.
A classic example is a news story screaming, "Eating chocolate makes you live longer."
Okay, I would love for that headline to be true.
We all would. But the reporter looks at a study finding that people who consume high amounts of dark chocolate tend to live into their late 80s or 90s. So the two things are happening at once. Eating chocolate and living a long time.
But the math doesn't actually support that the chocolate did it, does it? There is a hidden factor.
There's a massive hidden factor, what researchers call a confounding variable, and in this case, it's wealth.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, people who regularly buy lots of expensive, high-quality dark chocolate generally have a higher disposable income, and people with higher incomes can afford better medical care. They live in safer neighborhoods with less pollution, and they have gym memberships.
So the chocolate isn't physically extending their cellular lifespan.
No, the money is providing a protective buffer of healthcare and safety. The chocolate is merely a side effect of having the extra spending money. But, wealth provides access to preventative medicine isn't a fun, clickable headline.
No, nobody clicks on that. Chocolate saves your life is way better.
Exactly.
Then there is the missing control trap. And this one seems like a failure of basic middle school science fair rules.
It is the absolute foundation of the scientific method, yet it gets forgotten in the rush to publish. In any real experiment, you must have a comparison group, known as a control group.
Right.
Imagine a company invents a new sports drink and claims it makes athletes run faster. They give the drink to a high school track team, and after a month of daily practice, every runner drops their mile time by 10 seconds.
And the news reports, new drink slashes running times.
Yep.
But you can't claim the drink worked unless you also track a second group of runners who did the exact same daily practices but just drank regular water.
Precisely. If the water group also dropped their times by 10 seconds.
Then the drink did absolutely nothing. It was literally just the practice.
Right. The media often reports on the group that took the intervention and completely forgets to ask what happened to the people who didn't.
These sound like simple, almost comical logical errors. But the sources provide historical examples showing how these math mix-ups have massive, sometimes devastating, real-world consequences. Take the famous Mozart effect from the 1990s.
Oh, this is a wild story.
The idea that listening to classical music makes you smarter. Where did that actually start?
So it started with this microscopic study in 1993. Researchers took a small group of college students, had them listen to a Mozart sonata for a few minutes, and then gave them a very specific, narrow puzzle.
What kind of puzzle?
Just folding and cutting shapes out of paper. The students who listened to the music performed slightly better on this one specific paper folding task for a window of about 15 minutes.
Wait, college students got slightly better at folding paper for 15 minutes. That was the entirety of the science?
That was it.
How did the media translate that?
The media stripped away all the nuance. ignored the specific nature of the paper folding task, and just cranked the hype dial to the absolute maximum.
So it became a totally different cake.
Completely different. The headline started as, "Listening to Mozart improves your brain." Then it mutated, as things do in a game of telephone, into, "Listening to classical music makes babies geniuses."
Oh, wow.
It sparked a massive cultural craze. Pregnant women were strapping headphones to their stomachs. It escalated to the point where the governor of Georgia actually diverted $100,000 of state funds to buy classical music CDs to distribute to the parents of every single newborn baby in the state.
$100,000 of taxpayer money based on 15 minutes of college students folding paper. That perfectly illustrates the sheer power of a catchy, simplified headline.
It really does.
But the sources point out another example where it wasn't just a waste of money, it actually hurt people. What was the 1995 pill scare?
Yeah, this is a much darker illustration of how getting the math wrong, specifically failing to explain probability, can cause a massive public health crisis. In 1995, the news media in the United Kingdom reported that a certain type of widely used medication was doubling the risk of a severe blood clotting issue for the women taking it.
Okay, if I am taking a medication and I see a headline that says, my risk of a blood clot has doubled, I am going to panic. That sounds like an imminent threat to my life.
It is a terrifying word, but the news completely failed to distinguish between relative risk and absolute risk. They basically failed to do the fraction trick for the reader.
What were the actual numbers?
The actual absolute risk of getting this blood issue without the medicine was roughly 1 in 7,000. With the medicine, the risk went up to 2 in 7,000.
Wait, out of 7,000 people, only one additional person would be affected.
Yes. The relative risk doubled from 1 to 2, but the absolute risk to any individual person was still microscopically tiny.
A change from 1 in 7,000 to 2 in 7,000 is an incredibly small shift in reality.
Very small. But because the news only blasted the terrifying word doubled, a massive wave of panic swept the country. Thousands of women immediately stopped taking their medicine without even consulting their doctors.
Oh.
And because they stopped, it caused a wave of unintended medical emergencies and complications. The panic itself caused significantly more harm than the tiny statistical increase in the blood issue, all because reporters did not understand how to properly contextualize a fraction.
Okay, so we've seen how the news can get the math completely wrong and cause a panic. But the sources highlight a completely different trap, one that reporters fall into even when they get the math perfectly right.
Yes, and this happens when they are actually trying to be good, ethical journalists.
Which is crazy to think about.
It is perhaps one of the most insidious problems in modern media. The researchers call it the trap of false balance, or the illusion of fairness.
Okay, unpack this for us.
To understand why this happens, you have to look at the traditional training of a journalist. In political reporting, fairness is the ultimate goal. If a city mayor says they want to raise taxes to build a new bridge, a good political reporter will find a city council member who opposes the bridge and let them speak too.
You present both sides of the argument equally so the voters can make up their own minds.
Exactly. That is the gold standard for political journalism.
You want a balanced debate because it's a matter of opinion and policy.
But science is not a political debate. Science is an accumulation of measurable evidence. Let's look at a scenario where 99% of the world's experts, people who have spent decades analyzing the data, running the models, and testing the hypotheses, all agree on a single scientific fact.
99%.
But there is a tiny 1% fringe group that disagrees, often relying on flawed data or sometimes zero evidence at all.
Right.
If a television news producer wants to be fair, they will invite one expert from the 99% or one person from the 1% and put them on a split screen.
So they give them equal time. As a viewer sitting at home, I'm looking at two people in suits arguing. It looks like a 50-50 tie. My brain registers it as a completely unresolved debate.
That's exactly what happens.
It's like if 99 weather forecasters look at the radar and say a hurricane is coming, and one guy looking at a brick wall says it's going to be a beautiful sunny day, and the news puts them both on a split screen, I have no idea if I need to evacuate or go to the beach.
It's a perfect analogy. By giving that unsupported fringe view the exact same amount of airtime and visual weight as the established science, the media creates an illusion of respectability.
It deeply confuses the public.
It makes you think the scientific community is fractured and fighting, when in reality the consensus is overwhelming.
And the sources look at specific historical examples to show how this false balance actually plays out in the real world. Let's look at the data on how this impacted the coverage of climate change. And just as a quick reminder, we are strictly looking at what the media studies tell us about how these topics were covered, not debating the policies themselves.
Right, completely impartial. We're just looking at the communication mechanics. So the researchers analyzed the media visibility of climate change, the overwhelming consensus in the scientific community, which surveys place somewhere between 97 and 99 out of every 100 climate experts, is that human activity is causing the globe to warm.
Okay, so that's the 99 weather forecasters.
Exactly. However, a comprehensive study from the University of California, Merced, tracked how this consensus was actually portrayed in the mainstream news. They looked at the airtime and the quotes.
And what did they find?
They found that the media was giving the tiny handful of people who deny this is happening roughly half of the total visibility.
They took less than 3% of the experts and handed them 50% of the microphone.
They engineered a 50-50 debate out of a 99-to-1 reality.
Wow.
The sources point to another stark example, the coverage of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, and the completely disproven idea that it was linked to developmental issues in children.
Again, just looking at the media coverage here.
Right. The scientific consensus, backed by massive global studies, was completely clear that there was no link. But television news programs gave equal weight to the fringe theory. They created a false balance.
And the result of that?
Parents saw this debate playing out on their screens, assumed the science was unsettled, and many stopped trusting the vaccine. According to the research, this media-created confusion directly led to outbreaks of preventable diseases that had previously been totally under control.
So this false balance isn't just like an annoying quirk of television production. It actively stalls society. It prevents us from fixing actual problems.
It really does. And the journalism experts in our sources emphasize a critical point. This confusion isn't always an innocent mistake by a producer trying to be fair.
Wait, it's intentional.
This vulnerability in the media's rulebook is actively exploited by large industries.
Okay, how do you exploit the media's desire to be fair?
Well, historically, we have seen massive corporate entities like the tobacco industry in the mid-20th century or the fossil fuel industry later on hire sophisticated public relations teams specifically to manufacture doubt.
Manufacture doubt.
Yeah, if a corporation knows that the scientific data is proving their product is harmful, they realize they don't actually need to prove the science wrong. Proving it wrong is mathematically impossible.
So what do?
All they need to do is fund a few contrarian voices, demand that the news give them equal time in the name of fairness, and suddenly the waters are totally muddied.
They literally use the media's own ethics against them.
Precisely. The public gets confused, politicians argue about the unsettled science, and regulations or actions are delayed for decades. They turn the media's noble pursuit of fairness into a weapon of paralysis.
Let's take a step back and look at the factory so far.
It's a mess.
It is. We have a system where terrified scientists are throwing too much sugar on their cupcakes to keep their lab funding. We have broke, overworked journalists copying and pasting PR summaries without checking the hidden factors. We have rushed reporters messing up fractions and causing health panics. And we have television stations creating fake split-screen debates that confuse everybody.
It is an incredibly messy, dysfunctional factory.
But the final piece of the puzzle is how that flawed product actually reaches the consumer. The delivery method, the final mile of the journey, has completely transformed, especially for younger generations.
This is a huge shift.
This is where we get into the media consumption surveys.
Yeah.
How are people actually interacting with this news today?
So the Pew Research Center conducted a massive, detailed study focusing on adults between the ages of 18 and 29. They found that this demographic is following traditional news less than any other age group on record.
Less than anyone else.
Yeah, only 15% of them say they follow the news closely.
You know, the immediate assumption older people make is that young adults just aren't paying attention to the world, that they're just completely checked out.
But the data reveals that is a total misconception. They are paying attention, but they were consuming information through a completely different architecture. They aren't typing in the web address of a traditional newspaper or sitting on the couch at 6 o'clock to watch an evening broadcast.
So how do they get it?
The news is finding them. 70% of these young adults report that they get their political and scientific news, incidentally.
Meaning they aren't looking for it, they just happen to scroll past it while they're looking at something else.
Yes, they are absorbing it while navigating apps like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And the truly paradigm-shifting statistic from the Pew Research is this. These young adults trust the information they see incidentally on social media just as much as they trust rigorous traditional national news organizations.
They place the exact same amount of trust in a random video that popped up on their phone as they do in an institution that has fact-checkers and editors.
It's wild.
Who is actually making the videos they're watching then?
Nearly 40% of young adults say they regularly get their news from news influencers.
Those influencers.
Yeah, these are online personalities who have built massive followings. They are usually not trained journalists, they haven't studied media ethics, they don't know how to spot a confounding variable, and they certainly don't have editors fact-checking their scripts.
But to a young adult, the very definition of a journalist has shifted.
Completely. A journalist is no longer someone who works for a paper. A journalist is simply anyone who makes a compelling, confident video about current events on their phone.
Okay, let's go back to the food analogy. Because instead of actively deciding to sit down and eat a balanced meal prepared by a professional chef.
Which would be like choosing to read a well-researched newspaper.
Right. Instead of doing that, it's like you're walking down a long school hallway and suddenly a vending machine just launches a bag of extremely spicy artificial chips directly at your head.
The chips are the incidental news.
Exactly. But how does the machine decide to throw them?
Well, if you catch those spicy chips and eat them, the vending machine takes notes.
Okay.
It registers that you stopped walking and engaged with the product. So the machine actually sprouts legs, follows you around the school, and just keeps throwing more and more of those exact same spicy chips at you all day long.
You never even see a vegetable. You never see an apple. You are just surviving on an endless bombardment of spicy chips.
That captures the exact mechanics of a social media recommendation algorithm. An algorithm is just a highly advanced computer program designed by tech companies with one primary directive: keep your eyes glued to the screen for as long as humanly possible.
So the company can show you more advertisements and make more money.
Right, the vending machine wants to keep you in the hallway forever.
And how do the computer programs actually keep us looking?
The programs have fundamentally mapped human psychology. They have learned that human beings cannot look away from things that trigger intense primal emotions, specifically anger, fear, outrage, and moral superiority.
So nuance is bad for business.
Horrible for business. Nuanced, careful, dry scientific reporting. The vegetables, in your analogy, does not keep people glued to their screens. It makes them think. And thinking often leads to putting the phone down.
So the program actively searches for the most emotionally charged, polarizing, extreme content and pushes it to the very top of your feed.
It aggressively prioritizes the spicy chips.
Wow.
Furthermore, the program constructs an invisible cage around you, which researchers call an echo chamber.
How does that work?
Once the algorithm figures out what you already believe or what makes you angry, it only shows you videos that confirm those existing beliefs. It actively filters out any contradictory evidence, any boring context, or any opposing viewpoints.
So you become trapped in a digital bubble.
Yes. A bubble where everyone seems to agree with you, and anyone who disagrees is framed not just as incorrect, but as a dangerous enemy.
If you are getting your science news information about your health, the environment, your safety, from a machine that is explicitly designed to make you angry and isolate you in a bubble, that is a terrifying recipe.
It creates a highly volatile society. When you combine the desperate hype generated by the scientists, the mathematical mistakes and copy-pasting from rushed journalists, the false balance of television, and finally, a computer program that feeds on outrage to deliver the final product, you get real-world tragedies.
The failure to communicate science properly isn't just an academic problem. It has massive human costs.
Absolutely.
What kind of real-world costs are the sources pointing to?
The research highlights two major overarching examples of massive communication breakdowns in recent history. And again, we're examining the mechanics of the messaging here. We're not endorsing specific political policies.
Right, strictly the communication breakdown.
First, they point to the decades ignored warnings about the warming climate. The underlying science was relatively clear and stable for a long time, but the communication of that science was easily hijacked.
It was stalled by PR teams manufacturing doubt.
Exactly. Amplified by false balance on television, and finally locked into tribal echo chambers online.
And the second example?
Second, they point to the fragmented messaging during the global health crisis of the last few years.
The COVID pandemic.
Yes. The communication from health authorities during the pandemic was often highly technical, occasionally contradictory as new data came in, and delivered in a very sterile, authoritative tone.
Which didn't resonate well.
No, because the official messaging was so robotic and failed to address people's underlying anxieties, it created a massive information vacuum.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
It does. And that vacuum was immediately filled by social media influencers, political commentators, and algorithmic echo chambers. These voices knew exactly how to use emotion, fear, and tribal identity to win over the public's trust.
That they completely bypassed the dry scientific data. It sounds like the scientists are bringing a calculator to a poetry slam. They are standing on stage just trying to read raw numbers off a spreadsheet, while everyone else in the room is shouting, singing, crying, and making the audience feel things.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the disconnect. Because historically, scientists have been explicitly trained to communicate like robots.
Really, like in school?
Yeah, in graduate school, they are taught to strip all emotion from their writing, to state only the facts, to remain completely neutral, and to never, ever venture into advocacy. The foundational belief in the scientific community has always been that the data should just speak for itself.
But human beings do not process information like a spreadsheet.
We absolutely do not. Humans are deeply emotional and inherently tribal. We make decisions based on our core values, our deep-seated fears, and our allegiance to who we trust within our social circles.
So when scientists refuse to engage with the emotional reality of human beings,
they leave an empty stage. And loud, manipulative people, whether they are politicians, industry lobbyists, or just internet influencers looking for clicks, will gladly step onto that empty stage and win the argument by speaking directly to human emotion.
Yeah, the sources gave a really interesting example of this dynamic working in reverse, right? When a scientific message actually succeeded because it leaned into emotion.
Yes. The research highlights the documentary film made by Al Gore called An Inconvenient Truth. Now, setting aside any political feelings about the man himself from a purely analytical, communicative standpoint, that movie reached exponentially more people and drove more conversation than any dry, 1,000-page scientific report ever published on the topic.
And why was that?
Because it utilized narrative. It used a human story. It connected raw data to emotional stakes. It visualized the threat in a way that people could actually feel.
It's like if a doctor wants you to live a long, healthy life, they shouldn't just hand you a dense medical textbook and say, read chapter 4 to understand the cellular benefits of broccoli.
No one is reading that chapter.
You would never read it. They need to look you in the eye and say, listen, as your doctor and someone who genuinely cares about your future, eating this is going to give you the energy you need to play with your kids and feel great.
They have to actually speak human.
They have to speak human.
Facts alone, just thrown at a wall, are rarely enough to change human behavior. The communication has to be tailored to the audience, it has to be engaging, and it has to connect with their underlying values.
So after looking at all this research, how do we fix this giant broken factory? Because we can't realistically expect every single scientist in the lab coat to suddenly become a charismatic movie director.
No, we definitely can't. But the research offers tangible, practical solutions. There's a lot of hope in the data.
Let's hear it.
Let's look at a fascinating study from Northwestern University. They wanted to know if there was a simple psychological way to fix the seesaw trap, that false balance we talked about, where a fringe denier gets equal time on TV and confuses everyone.
Did the researchers actually find a fix?
They did, and it is remarkably straightforward. They found that you don't necessarily have to ban the fringe view from the article entirely. All you have to do is clearly and explicitly remind the reader of the expert consensus.
Yeah, what does that mean in practice?
If a news article simply includes a single sentence stating, "The vast majority of experts overwhelmingly agree on this topic," readers are significantly less likely to be fooled by the one denier quoted later in the story.
Just telling people what the majority thinks acts as a shield.
It acts as a psychological anchor. When the brain is presented with conflicting information, it naturally looks for social proof. By clearly stating the consensus, you anchor the reader's brain in the established reality. It stops them from floating away into the confusion of the split screen.
That is such a simple, actionable fix, but it requires the newsrooms to actually commit to doing it.
Right.
What about the beginning of the factory? How do we fix the scientists?
The sources suggest a structural overhaul there, too. Universities need to stop rewarding scientists solely based on the sheer volume of papers they publish. They need to completely dismantle the publish or perish pressure cooker.
And what should they reward instead?
They should start rewarding scientists for taking the time to engage with the public, for explaining their work clearly without all the hype, and for publishing those vital null results that move the whole field forward safely.
Okay, and what about the people listening to us right now? The people at the very end of the assembly line who are just trying to buy a slice of cake. What can they do to protect themselves when they open their phones tomorrow morning?
As a consumer of information, your greatest defense is active awareness. First, actively look past the emotional headline. When you feel your blood pressure rise or a flash of anger at a headline, pause.
Let's take a breath.
Remember that the headline was explicitly engineered by a machine to make you click, not to educate you. Second, always ask yourself,
Right.
what is the consensus here? Don't let your worldview be shifted by one surprising study about chocolate or lucky socks. Look for what the vast majority of experts in that specific field are saying.
Look for the anchor.
Exactly. And finally, remember the chaotic factory. When you read a story, remember that it was likely summarized by a PR team trying to protect funding, rushed out by an overworked reporter who might have skipped checking the control group, and pushed directly to your phone by a computer algorithm desperately trying to keep you engaged.
Once you visualize that chaotic, messy factory, it becomes much harder to be tricked by the final product.
That completely changes the context of what you're reading.
It changes how I'm going to look at every single article or video from now on.
Yeah.
You really have to be an active participant. You can't just be a passive consumer standing in the hallway letting the vending machine throw spicy chips at you.
No, you have to actively hunt for the vegetables.
You really do.
It requires vigilance. But before we finish today, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing the failures of human beings. We've talked about human scientists getting desperate, human journalists getting rushed, and human readers getting tripped by their own emotions.
Right. It's fundamentally a story about human flaws.
But think about the technological trends we've discussed today. If scientists are increasingly relying on artificial intelligence to write and review their complex research papers,
Oh boy.
and if underfunded, broke newsrooms inevitably start using artificial intelligence to automatically summarize those papers into news articles without any human reporters involved.
Oh man, the pipeline.
And if social media algorithms, which are themselves a form of artificial intelligence, are the sole deciders of which of those articles actually get pushed onto your phone screen,
Oh, wait.
are we rapidly approaching a future where machines are just endlessly talking to other machines? A completely closed system generating content for other machines to sort, summarize, and distribute? While we humans, the ones whose health, safety, and lives are actually affected by this science, are entirely left out of the conversation.
That is a deeply unsettling and fascinating question to end on. If the machines are writing the recipe, baking the cake, and driving the delivery truck, who is actually watching the factory? Thanks for coming along on this deep dive with us. Remember to follow us on your favorite podcast platform, and see you on the next dive.